Hi, everybody. I'm Jay Lockman, and I'm chairing the first session. And first of all, let me welcome you to Green Bank. And we're going to start off with a few welcome talks and a little bit of administrative matters. And let me introduce Adam Cohen, President of Associated Universities Incorporated, who runs this joint.
Thank you, Jay. So when Jay said a talk, mine is mostly a 5-minute intro, and I have to welcome people. He asked me if I wanted to talk, and I said, that's about what I can handle in a crowd like this. So that's what I'm going to do. So let me start by saying thank you so much to Martine and to Jay and to Green Bank and to the National Science Foundation, all of whom had a role in making this happen. So it's really wonderful. The sponsorship for the workshop is very, very much appreciated, and this is going to prove to be a really interesting, exciting talk. I will say that things are very exciting at AUI. I've been there for about 18 months, and we continue to explore opportunities for expanding our portfolio, but really exciting is that we just put in a 5-year extension proposal to run Green Bank Observatory and explore how we can continue to use this site and the assets here on this site to push into both the existing fields and new areas. And it's really interesting to think about what this site could do over the next 5 years to 50 years. And so we're really exploring how that could expand our portfolio and some of the interesting things we can do, including how do we expand this area of astrobiology and pursue some of the astrochemistry. I do have to say that, so I'm not an astronomer, but I've been in this position long enough where I get really excited when I see some of the results that come across my desk, and the results just continue to be phenomenal. I usually say out of this world, but I think that joke would be lost on this man. But things like looking at the first signature of chain molecules that came from this facility, or looking at some of the other spectacular results that come from polymer, the VLA, or some combination. It's just really interesting to see that, and it sort of reminds you as to why you focus on things like managing such great organizations and facilities, because you have to enable this type of science to occur. So I'm really looking forward to this workshop. I'm looking forward to continuing to learn more about this field. And with that, I will turn it over to Karen. Or to
Yes. Thanks. And next we're going to hear from Karen O'Neill, who's the director of the Green Bank Observatory.
So let me first just echo Adam and say welcome to Green Bank. Those of you that have been here before and are familiar faces, it's always great to see you again. We love seeing people come back, but even more exciting is when we get to see new faces, people that haven't been to Green Bank, haven't gotten to experience what at least I think of as the very special place that Green Bank is. And so it's wonderful to have you guys here. We'll see a lot of you, and you'll learn a lot about the site. Just as we're here, you'll get a chance, for those of you who are brave enough to do it, to go up this telescope if the weather's good while you're here. But just to give you a feel for why it's so exciting to have particularly this type of workshop here in Green Bank. So we are the original site of the National Radio Astronomy Observatory. We've since split off, although happily we still get to be part of Associated Universities Incorporated. And so we've been around here for more than 60 years, and you'll see those 60 years as you walk around the site. If you take one of the buses down the site, you'll see the various telescopes we have. Some of these telescopes are still in operation. Some are actually historical and not currently under any contracts to be used, with the center, of course, being the Robert C. Byrd Green Bank Telescope. But in addition to the history that we have here with the telescopes, it's not about the telescopes. They're cool, they're awesome, they're great engineering. But what's really exciting about this place is the history that we have. And if you want to just think about astrobiology and Green Bank, I actually started to make a slide where I thought this would give me a great idea. I was going to take all the cool discoveries that we've had in Green Bank and list them on one slide. But the font had to be so tiny I couldn't even read it at my desk. There are just way too many exciting things that have happened with a 60-year history in radio astronomy. So I just picked a few. These are a few that have been mentioned from other discoveries. But just to give you a feel for the fact that for Green Bank, having a conference on astrobiology is really very fitting. We're excited to have you guys here. I feel like it fits well with not just the science that we do now. We've got, this is from Breakthrough Listen when they got started. That's Frank reliving his days back with inventing the Drake equation. I think that was from a movie shot, actually. But so we have a long history with it, but also a lot of the work that we're doing right now here in Green Bank. And so it's just want to say again, we're very excited to have you guys here, and just welcome to Green Bank, and please enjoy yourself while you're here. With that, I'll hand it off to Jay.
Thank you. Where's my... Okay, I'm just going to give you some administrative comments and a few things just to think about and know about. Those of you who read the New York Times know that we are in the land where the internet ends. This was actually one of the better pieces done on us, and you know that the internet doesn't end, it just ends in a wire, and we do everything here with the wire. But yes, and so that's what we think of as a phone. Just please turn off all wireless devices while you're here. Airplane mode, it turns out, is not good enough for radio astronomers. Please just kill them. And no digital devices past the gate. We have analog film, I guess is the right word, cameras available for you if you want to use them. And when we do the tour on Monday, we'll be able to have film cameras available to document that. Okay, this is to remind me, oh gosh, there's in your packet, there is a poll about your attitude towards life outside of Earth. If you would just fill that out and drop it out at the desk outside during the coffee break, very informal, just interested in what people think on these two simple questions about what we're doing in the next 10 years and where we'll be 25 years from now. Your badges get you free meals in the cafeteria, and if you wish, none of you will want to skip any sessions, but you may have companions that might want to take the tour that's offered in the Science Center, and the badge will get you in that for free. We've given out coffee cups. Please use them. That way we don't have to buy disposable coffee cups. There's a memory stick also that I believe everyone has. That has the program on it. It has some posters about the observatory, information about the observatory, things like that. We have connections to the internet in room 137, which is halfway down the hall on the left, and room 217, which is just after you make the right into the old part of the building. There are offices in both places. 137 is a conference room with a lot of those Ethernet cables that you can use to plug in between sessions. All the meals are in the cafeteria. Site map. Yes, I mentioned the Science Center. Okay, well, let's go with site map. Yeah, we have 5 square miles here at the observatory that adjoins National Forest, and so we have every animal that's more or less living in the east comes to visit and take the tour and so on. You will see bears. There's never been an incident. These are not grizzly bears. These are nice, friendly bears. Still, back away, okay? Don't panic, just walk away. Okay, what else do I have? There'll be a conference photo taken at the first coffee break right outside here. And so just when everyone leaves here for the first coffee break, just please head outside onto the grass and we'll take the photo. It would be great if we could preload your talks. And so just see me, or it's actually Jill is the person to see who knows how to do that. This is being webcast. There are instructions on our website on how to view this. If you have colleagues that want to watch, it'll be archived and you'll be able to see it at your leisure later on. Tonight's events are slightly different because this is the 50th anniversary of the first landing on the moon, and the Science Center, which is a facility that has 50,000 visitors a year right next door, is holding things all day. And tonight after supper, Chris Impey is going to give a lecture that is part of this workshop and also a public lecture. And so after supper, we'll move over to the Science Center for Chris's presentation. And then we'll also have a little special surprise just as an opening act for Chris. And finally, unfortunately, we do not have the ability to house everybody here right on site. We are between large student events. About 100 high school students left just this morning. They were here as part of a pulsar search collaboratory where they get real data from the GBT and learn to analyze it in teams from around the state and around the region. They just left, and coming in starting tomorrow will be our Physics Inspiring the Next Generation program. It's for underserved minorities, underrepresented minorities, to get kids involved in physical science research at an early age. And so we'll be mixing with them starting tomorrow and certainly on Monday. But anyway, as a result, we've had to put some of you off-site, and so I will try to coordinate rides. There should be plenty of people with cars. but just be aware that I'll be asking you to help each other out on this ride-sharing business. Finally, Karen mentioned Green Bank workshops. There have been many, 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 and this is the first. In 1961, a joint Soviet-American workshop held at a time when there was just not much scientific contact between the two countries. And it brought Soviet astronomers and US astronomers here to Green Bank. In the center is Otto Struve, there's Minkowski, Sorochenko, George Field is back there, Alan Sandage is back there, but in the lower left is a special person who's on the next slide blown up. Frank Drake was at the first Green Bank workshop, and we're pleased and delighted to have him back here now. And so with that, let me introduce...
Where's Carl Sagan?
He wasn't born then. I don't know where Carl Sagan is. I don't know, when did Carl come to the observatory, do you know? Did he?
1961,
1961?
but not for that meeting.
Ah, okay. We have a historian. With that, let me start the workshop, and we're right on time, and introduce Carl Pilcher, who's going to talk about Barry Blumberg and astrobiology. Okay.
I'll get carried away, but I probably reflect that you'll be okay. Well, thank you, everyone. You know, it's almost a cliche to say I'm honored to be here. I am truly, truly honored to be here to kick off the Barry Blumberg Memorial Workshop on Moonshots and Earthshots and the search for life beyond Earth, and to help us honor Barry by telling you a little bit about his life. And I'm going to have some assistance in doing that, as you're going to see. So Barry, I met Barry roughly in 2000, shortly after he became the founding director of the NASA Astrobiology Institute, which I will henceforth call the NAI repeatedly, but I know it's always good to define acronyms, even in an audience where I think most people know what the NAI is. I had the honor of succeeding Barry as director of the NAI, and the current director of the NAI is in fact in the back of the room, Penny Boston. I was the third director. Bruce Roniger from UCLA was the director in between Barry and I. So I got a chance to know Barry fairly well. And after he passed away in 2011, I wrote an article about him that was published in Astrobiology magazine, and that article leads to me being the speaker here today to tell you about Barry. He passed away on April 5th, 2011, and let me just read one sentence from the opening paragraph of this article. That Barry spent his last day conceptualizing an international research park on the moon befits the unflagging curiosity that characterized his life in general and his scientific career in particular. Barry passed away in the middle of an NASA Ames workshop. He had, in fact, just given a talk about 2 hours earlier, and probably the most merciful thing about his passing was it was instantaneous. So here he was at age 85 at a NASA workshop like this one, working, which is what he loved to do. So if you download this article and read it, it's open access and readily available. You'll learn a lot more than I'm going to be able to tell you in the next 50 minutes. One of my sources for both that article and this talk is Barry's autobiography, which is the autobiography of his telling his medical career. It was actually published in the last year that he was director of the Institute. And then there are other sources that are referenced in the article and another source that I'll be sharing with you in just a couple of minutes. So let me start off by addressing a question that I often get asked. Barry became the director of the NASA Astrobiology Institute at age 74 after a career in medical research that included the awarding of the Nobel Prize in 1976, Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, for discovering the hepatitis B virus and developing the first vaccine. So what, may you ask, would draw a man at the age of 74 after closing his medical laboratory and basically retiring from the career that had occupied his entire life, what would get him to become the founding director of a science institute in an entirely new field that was largely foreign, scientifically, to his life experience? Well, there are several answers, and you're going to see how those answers develop, but I wanted to give you some of the answers up front. Barry, as you will see, was very, very deeply interested in fundamental questions, and he saw that astrobiology asks fundamental questions about the nature of life, much more so than the NIH-supported programs, for example, that he had been working on, and I'll say more about that. Barry was very, very much committed to interdisciplinarity. You're going to see how that figured into the work that led to the Nobel Prize. And he was particularly interested in the sociology and the psychology of getting people to work together, and that was, of course, the charge to the NAI, was to get these disparate disciplines, all of which have contributions to make to astrobiology, to somehow get an astrophysicist to work with an environmental microbiologist, and that is no mean feat. He was also attracted by the fact that astrobiology involves geographic exploration in the form of field research in remote locations, and as you're going to see, field research in remote locations characterized his medical career as well. And finally, the multi-generational aspect of astrobiology appealed to his love of mentoring and learning from the next generation. So let me start off with Barry's early life and medical career, and at this point I'd like to get a little assistance in telling this story.
This is video 1. 1925 in New York City, in Brooklyn. I was born in 1925 in New York City, in Brooklyn, and actually born in our own house. In those days it was fashionable to be born at home, so my oldest sister and I were born at home. My younger brother, the fashion had passed by that time, so he was born in a hospital. I think I can actually remember when he was brought home, although he's only 3 years younger than I am. And I went to school there. It was Brooklyn in those days was quite a, I don't know how to put it, sort of small village-like place. It was very residential, tree-lined streets, and walked to all the shops, and sort of knew the shopkeepers. It was quite a, very kind of comfortable, safe appearing environment. Then I went to elementary school at a Jewish parochial school. So that was where we learned Hebrew and studied the Bible and the other parts of the canon and I was there for elementary school. And it had very high academic standards. Essentially, all the kids that went on to high school, of course, and I'd say 100% of them went on for university training. It was quite a small school. There couldn't have been more than 200 or 300 students when I was there. But I know of at least 2 Nobel laureates who went to that small elementary school. So and then I went to high school in Brooklyn initially at James Madison High School is the name of it. And again, that was extremely high academic standard. It was during the Depression, and many of our teachers would have in other times gone toward university. So quite a few of them had PhDs in math and science. My chemistry teacher in high school had a doctoral degree and had done research, and was really a wonderful teacher as well. And so the second high school I went to when our family moved was at Far Rockaway High School. These were both New York City high schools. And it also was a very high academic standard. And there are 3 Nobel laureates who graduated from that relatively small New York City high school, including Richard Feynman, who there's a very good book about him called Genius. And there's a chapter about Far Rockaway. And actually, I met Richard Feynman only once. And that was in Far Rockaway. And the reason I met him is I had taken his sister to the movies. And when he played a kind of practical joke, and when I came to take her to the movies, I've been talking about my interest in math and science. She was carrying a textbook on quantum mechanics that he'd given her. So we met briefly then, and I think he was teaching at Cornell at that time. She went on, by the way, to be a NASA scientist, and up until recently was working at the Jet Propulsion Lab.
For those of you who weren't fortunate enough to know Barry, that video, I think, begins to give you a sense of the kind of person he was. He was a warm, genuine human being, which I personally believe had a great deal to do with his success. And I did mean to say at the very beginning of this talk that he would have been tickled pink to be being honored at a workshop called Moonshots and Earthshots on the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing and the 43rd anniversary of the Viking 1 landing on Mars. He would have just been tickled pink by this. So that video is an excerpt from 7 hours of oral history that are on the web for you to peruse in your spare time. It's at Web of Stories, which is webofstories.com. He has wonderful stories to tell on that, and anybody who wants to get to know Barry, that's probably the best way that you can do it today. So let me fast forward. Barry is now a third-year medical student. It is 1950. He's in med school at Columbia, and he's fascinated with the tropics, as were many young men of his time. They were seen as very romantic in ways that we would not really consider acceptable today. But he had the opportunity to go to what was then Dutch Guiana, which is now Suriname, and he got to spend 3 months there working basically in tropical medicine. He was based in a town called Mungo, and the thing that made Mungo slightly well known is that it's the site of a huge bauxite mine that is an aluminum ore mine that in fact was the source of most of the aluminum ore used by both America and Canada during World War II. So there was an array of workers who had come from all over the world to Mungo to work in that mine, as well as people who were native to the region. Now, a couple of months into Barry's stay at Mungo, he went upriver. This is the Marawine River. He went upriver in a boat called a Corial, which is basically dug out from a single log. He went to an island right where that star is called Langatabache. It took him 4 days. Today there's a road that goes there and you can drive it in a little bit less than 2 hours. Here is a picture. I believe this one was taken on Langatabache, and there they are setting off in the Corial. What they were doing, he and another student were providing basic medical services. They were also studying disease in this fairly diverse population. They were studying filariasis, which is a very, very nasty parasitic disease caused by a parasitic roundworm. And they were doing this all among this very diverse population. So let me now have Barry tell you a little bit more about his experience in Suriname. At the beginning of this video, he refers to there. There is Labatabache, the
What I
island.
learned there, what was really impressive was how differently people responded to exposure to disease. So we were studying psoriasis, both there and back in the main town in Mungo, and we found a big difference in the prevalence of the filarion in the blood, this asymptomatic carrier state, between the people of African descent who had come as slaves and moved into the towns. And then the Indonesians, the people from Java mostly, and also there was a few Chinese, very few, and 4 or 5, there were only about half a dozen Europeans in the community. And that really struck me. It bore a strange similarity to the hepatitis business, where you have this carrier state, big difference dependent on huge geographic differences. And in this little town of Mungo, we had people living more or less the same environment, but came from totally different ethnic backgrounds. They maintained a lot of their ethnic practices, food and all that. So it was a really kind of testing. But that hit me, this idea that that was such big differences in response. And even within a population, some of them got infected and others didn't. So that got into the back part of my mind someplace. And
how did the difference manifest in your blood samples?
the difference.
So this was Barry's fundamental question. Why do some people get sick while others, exposed to the same environment and infectious agents, remain healthy? Or more precisely, how do inheritance, human behavior, and the environment interrelate in the context of disease? So what did Barry and his team do to work on this question? So in the late 1950s, they began studying genetic polymorphisms in diverse populations around the globe. Now, genetic polymorphisms are something that we're kind of used to today. They're just natural variants in the particular genes that you have. And you may have a gene for blue eyes and somebody else has a gene for brown eyes, and that's a genetic polymorphism. Somebody may have A-type blood and somebody may have B-type blood, and that's another genetic polymorphism. So these are fairly common, but some of them are associated with disease. Sickle cell disease and Tay-Sachs disease are a couple of examples of that. So what Barry was interested in doing was trying to see, are there associations, studying really diverse populations all over the globe, between genetic polymorphisms and disease. So they weren't able to study the genes in the late 1950s, but they could study the proteins that the genes produce. And the technique that is familiar to any microbiology student today of gel electrophoresis had actually just been invented in 1953 or 4. It had been paper electrophoresis before then, and gel electrophoresis provided much greater resolution. And it turned out to be something that they could do relatively easily in the field, as you will hear Barry talk about in the next little clip. So they did field work all over Basque Country, Nigeria, Northern Alaska, Greece, etc., etc. The list goes on and on. The data that they collected were mostly blood samples. They were studying blood serum for the most part, so that they were studying the liquid portion of the blood. And they had this conceptual framework, but they didn't have a specific hypothesis. It was just, let's look at the genetic polymorphisms and let's see if there is correlation with disease. So this was exploration in both the scientific as well as the geographical sense. And they did discover several polymorphic systems, including one involving lipoproteins, and those are the things that we always worry about, the LDL and HDL that we all worry about when we get our cholesterol checked. Those are all lipoproteins. And that system was associated with increased risk for diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So they had some success, and they had some other successes along those lines. But there were obstacles. Fundamentally, what they were doing was practicing the research for preventative medicine. The whole idea of finding genetic polymorphisms that were associated with disease was if you identified somebody, an individual that had a particular genetic makeup that was associated with a disease, you would know that that person was at greater risk for that disease, and maybe you could design an intervention that would prevent that person from actually getting sick. Well, preventative medicine was not then and is not now a much honored aspect of the medical profession. To make it worse, Barry was studying something that was really not seen as medicine at all. Human polymorphisms were at that time mainly used in forensics, paternity lawsuits, blood banking, and anthropology. So the medical community not only didn't honor preventative medicine that much, it didn't think human polymorphisms were really an important part of medicine yet. And to make it worse still, Barry was doing population studies. Everybody knew that laboratory studies and clinical studies are the only reliable sources of medical information. Population studies in the 1950s, not a very big thing. So despite those obstacles, Barry pressed on. He worked at NIH from 57 to 1964 in the face of skepticism about the value of what he was doing. And then he moved to what is now the Fox Chase Cancer Center, which was then the Institute for Cancer Research, ICR. This is a quote from Barry's autobiography. "My main problem at NIH was fitting what I wanted to do into the discipline-determined rigidity of the constituent institutes. And for those of you who do not know NIH is organized around disease and technique. So there's the National Cancer Institute, the National Eye Institute, the National Heart, Blood, and Lung Institute, the National Institute of Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Very strictly disciplinary oriented. So even though ICR, the Institute for Cancer Research that he moved to, was dedicated to cancer, we were never asked what relation our research had to immediate cancer applications. Let me show you a few pictures of Barry during this period. We're not sure exactly where and when this picture was taken, but we do know where this picture was taken. It was taken in the Brooks Range in Alaska when Barry was 33, and this was taken a few years later in Norway. So in order to do their field work, they developed a variation on a theme of gel electrophoresis, and this was a new technique. They used blood serum from patients who had received lots of blood transfusions, for example, hemophiliacs and people with other diseases that required multiple transfusions. The reason they did so was that when the transfused blood contained a protein variant, now remember, we're talking genetic polymorphisms here, so somebody's blood over here might have a version of a protein that's different than the protein that this person naturally produces. In some cases, that foreign protein would cause an immune response. When a foreign protein causes an immune response, we call that protein an antigen. An antigen derives from antibody generator because the immune response is the production by the person receiving this foreign protein of an antibody. So people who had received lots and lots of blood transfusions had, for the most part, received lots and lots of foreign proteins, and therefore their bodies had generated lots and lots of antibodies. And so the serum, the blood serum, from people who had undergone these transfusions was a rich source of diverse antibodies. And in fact, so much so that their serum was called anti-serum. So the technical technique that Barry and his team then used was called double diffusion agar gels. And so what they would do is, a gel is, looks like Jell-O, looks like clear Jell-O. Sure, many people in this room have seen them. And you create little wells when you pour the gel, and then you put the things that you want to investigate into the wells, and then you turn on the electric field, and things migrate based on their charge and their mass and size, and things separate. So what they did was they put the anti-serum in a central well, and then they had a bunch of wells arranged in a circle around it. They took the serum from the people they were testing out in the field in adjacent wells, And then they turned on the electric field, and if the test subject serum contained a protein for which the anti-serum contained an antibody, they would bind, precipitate, and you could visualize them. So let me let Barry tell you what happened next.
We had developed a kind of very simple technique that used very simple equipment. These studies using the transfused serum were done on agar gel, and you could make a plate on a small glass plate, and you could buy this agar gel for very little money. You can have all the equipment you need with an expenditure of under $100. So, and we can use it in the field too. We developed methods so I could take it with you. You can work in a hotel room or a train or things like that. So we continued looking for more antibodies, and we found several. But one that really looked interesting was one that was clearly different from the lipoprotein polymorphism. It, of course, reacted with it. And it was very rare. Instead of being a kind of polymorphic distribution of the kind that we'd seen in the past, this, we initially only found a small group of people who reacted with this particular antiserum. So this was an antiserum from a transfused patient from New York City. And the early studies were done on serum from Australia, which was this pattern. If you're looking for variation, then you use different populations because the prevalence or the frequency of a gene would vary from population to population. We knew that from what we know about polymorphisms. So here we had, this antibody from a patient in New York City reacted with a antigen that was present in Australia. Now, as far as we knew, neither of those people were, the transfused patient had some illness that required it, hemophilia. But it didn't seem to be related to this antibody. And the Australian who had the antigen, it was a non-hospitalized person as far as we understood. It wasn't, he or she wasn't ill. Well, the question was, what was it? And, all right, so what do? Get more data. You start collecting more information from which to make the next hypothesis. So we collected we did lots of studies. You can do them very quickly. You can do hundreds of experiments,
So there it is. That's the Australia antigen. One of those wells had the anti-serum. I think it was the top well, and that one had the serum from an Australian Aborigine. They continued doing this, and in that video, you saw Barry's approach to science. You discover something interesting, and what do after that? You get more data. So that's what he did. He continued studying this, and what he found, and when I say he was working with a team of people by this time, and what they found was that the Australia antigen, as they called it, was common in Asia, the Pacific, Africa, Eastern and Southern Europe, but it was not common in the US, and it was not common in Western Europe, and that's an important part of this story. The data, remember again, they were looking for genetic polymorphisms. So going in, they were looking for inherited relationships, so that they were looking at multi-generations. And initially, the data about the Australia antigen seemed to fit their genetic polymorphism model. But there were some surprising exceptions, and I don't have time to go into them here. I do go into some of them in the paper. But then something that to me is just really bizarre was recognized, and that is that the people who had the Australia antigen also tended to be people who had had lots of transfusions, or at least one transfusion, I should say, not lots. So now we have transfuse patients with an antigen that's reacting with an antibody in a multiple transfused patient. Sure sounds like maybe there's some potential blood-borne infectious dimension to this, not a genetic relationship. And so their thinking began to shift from genetic polymorphisms to blood-transmitted infectious agents. They did studies of normal populations, since they were looking at populations that they thought might be at risk of particular diseases. They wanted to look at normal populations. And one of the normal populations they used was just the general population in the United States, where the Australia antigen was quite rare. But there were some rare instances. An AU plus means an individual who had the Australia antigen. In one case, it was someone who had been diagnosed with hepatitis B, and in another case, someone who had just received a transfusion. And so they started thinking that maybe we've got the blood-borne agent that is responsible for hepatitis B. And it was known that hepatitis B infections frequently followed blood transfusions. So it was understood that hepatitis B was associated with a blood-borne infectious agent, and they thought, could we possibly have it? To cut a long story short, they did a lot of work, which I'm not going to talk about here. It is in the paper. And they came to the conclusion that, yea, verily, they had found the hepatitis B blood-borne infectious agent. So what do? They submit a paper. Makes sense. The evidence was piling up. They submitted a paper reporting the association of the Australia antigen with acute hepatitis to the journal Annals of Internal Medicine. The paper was rejected. Why was the paper rejected? No one on the team was a virologist. No one had any formal training in epidemiology. No one had been involved in the many, many, many years of research on finding the hepatitis B infectious agent. I mean, hepatitis B causes jaundice. And jaundice is an illness that has been studied for centuries. So there was a large community that had been trying to find the source of hepatitis B, that is the infectious agent, for many, many years. And Barry and his team were interlopers. They were newcomers. What did they know about virology? What did they know about epidemiology? What did they know about any of this? That was about the time that Barry read Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and it provided some perspective. And he began to think that, I think we may be just at that tipping point that Kuhn described, when the evidence piles up to the point that suddenly scientific opinion shifts very quickly. But it hadn't quite shifted yet. There had been many erroneous claims of discovery of what they called serum hepatitis. That was the name they gave to the infectious agent before they knew what it was. And the reviewer thought that this might be another such claim. This was something that the reviewer told Barry years later. And here are a couple of quotes from Barry. If such rejections are taken too seriously, they can lead to an attitude of martyrdom and of opposition to a recalcitrant establishment. Our unhappy sentiments didn't last, and the rebuff didn't slow us down. And this next quote captures something that I think that's really, really important. One of the most important steps we took was to distribute vials of the antiserum and the antigen to investigators who requested them. With these, it was very easy for scientists, even in laboratories with rudimentary equipment, to repeat and extend our studies. Within a few months, there was confirmation from other investigators, often from parts of the world where hepatitis B was more common than in the US. I think there's an awful lot rolled in to that quote. Two things in particular are, one, the fact that Barry's response to this rejection and to the resistance on the part of the medical community was to give away his discoveries, to give away the antiserum and the serum samples to laboratories all over the world. How many people who discover something then promptly give it away and send it out to as many laboratories as they could find? What Barry was always concerned about was the progress of the science. He was not concerned so much about the personal credit, as important as personal credit is. The second thing is in this little part of the quote, often from parts of the world where hepatitis B was more common than in the United States. There was a lot more interest in finding the cure to hepatitis B in places where many, many, many people were dying from hepatitis B. Hepatitis B doesn't kill you directly, but it causes primary cancer of the liver. Virtually all primary cancers of the liver are associated with hep B infections. And primary cancer of the liver kills millions of people across the world. The virus that Barry developed has been credited with saving tens of millions to hundreds of millions of lives, and sometimes you'll hear somebody say 1 billion lives. And if you integrate over the time that the vaccine has been in wide use, that's kind of plausible. So here's the hep B virus. It's actually a very simple virus. The Australia antigen is the surface coat. This is a protein that coats the surface of the virus. So the nomenclature here is hepatitis B surface antigen. That is the Australia antigen. This is a picture, micrograph, of the serum from an infected individual. All of these small circles and all of these linear things that are about the same width as the small circles, those are all the surface antigen. Those are all the surface coat. The virus sheds this surface coat such that in a blood sample from an infected individual, the ratio of surface antigen to actual virus is about 1,000 to 1. So lots and lots and lots of the Australia antigen, this surface protein, in the sample of an individual. There are only 3 complete intact viruses in this picture. One is there, one is there, and one is there. So, saving lives. It's interesting. There was resistance even to screening blood for this antigen at the beginning. Today, and actually by the early 1970s, all donated blood was being screened for the surface antigen using the test developed by Barry and his team, and wherever that screening was put in place, transfusion transmission of the hep B virus was vastly, vastly reduced, and in some cases virtually eliminated. What Barry's team had shown was that antigen, the Australia antigen, the surface protein, was in fact the protective agent. In other words, if you got inoculated just with the surface antigen, not with all the live virus removed, you would be protected against hep B infection. And so what they did, because the surface antigen is so abundant in the blood of people who have had hepatitis B infections, they were able to isolate it, separate it from the live virus, and developed it as a vaccine. Since 1982, the vaccine has been made through recombinant DNA techniques, but the hep B vaccine that you might get today, if you were traveling to some place where hep B is still prevalent, it's the same vaccine. It's just made in a way that gives people more confidence because there's no chance of there being live virus still in the vaccine, which there was using the technique that Barry did. And I've already talked about how this has saved lives. And that led to this, 1976, Barry and the King of Sweden. He shared the Nobel Prize that year with Carleton Gajdusek, who he didn't work with. Gajdusek discovered the source of Kuru, which is another story, and Gajdusek's another interesting story, which you can look up if you're interested. What's also interesting is who were Barry's fellow Nobel laureates that year. There's Barry. Milton Friedman is the person who he's chatting with. Sam Ting, well-known physicist, well-known to many people in this audience, I'm sure, got the prize that year. William Lipscomb and Burton Richter. So quite an array of folks, and there is Barry celebrating, and there is his wife Jean, to whom he was married for 57 years. This is at Fox Chase. So this brings me to Barry and astrobiology. So I think everybody in this audience knows that astrobiology addresses fundamental questions. I won't read them. Barry encapsulated astrobiology's questions into the question, what is life? And he really saw astrobiology as really asking the most fundamental questions about life that one can ask. It was 1997. Barry was invited to join Stanford's program on human biology, where he taught medical anthropology. He was invited to attend a workshop at Ames called the Astrobiology Roadmap Workshop in July 1998. This workshop emerged from the event that triggered that workshop. Happened on August 7th, 1996. And it was a press conference in NASA headquarters where a group of scientists announced that they thought they had found evidence of life in a meteorite from Mars known as ALH 84001. That led to something called the Space Summit, which was something that some politicians had been calling for, but most everybody else had been ignoring. NASA's space science budget was going into a death spiral. And what came out of that press conference was an understanding on the part of not just scientists, but of the political system as well, that really there was a confluence of discoveries, including the discoveries of the first extrasolar planets, which happened in November 1995 from the Swiss group, and then in March 1996 from the US group of Marcy and Butler, that we were beginning to understand enough about objects in this solar system, beginning to understand, or at least discover planets around other stars. Our understanding of the basic nature of life, the three domains of life, the work of Carl Woese had really come to fruition roughly about 1990 with a publication of Carl's in PNAS. And so there was a realization that this was the time to really pursue these things, and NASA's budget got bumped up by $1 billion per year. And that went into a variety of planetary science and mainly planetary science and astrophysics programs. And when I say planetary science, I mean divisionally. That is the Planetary Science Division and the Astrophysics Division at NASA headquarters. Astrobiology was assigned to the Planetary Science Division, and the Astrobiology Institute was formed, and this workshop was a workshop to figure out what is this field of astrobiology, what should be the scope for the NASA Astrobiology Institute and for the astrobiology program. And so this was Barry's introduction to astrobiology, was that workshop. And again, the questions intrigued him, and he noted as well that NASA was applying the scientific process to questions that had in prior generations largely been the purview of philosophers and theologians and ethicists, etc. There's Barry with Dan Golden, who was then the NAI director. Barry became the director of the NAI, founding director in 1999, and he served through 2002. And now let me have Barry tell you a little bit about that.
The tracks, very good scientists. Okay, so all these teams were spread around the country. Several in California, Texas, the East Coast, we have Massachusetts, and there were several that, and it was for 5 years. So it was highly competitive, and there were like 50 teams competed, and we selected initially 10 or 11, and then we added another 5 later. And they're high, the level of science was amazing. The field attracts very good scientists. Okay, so all these teams were spread around the country. several in California, Texas, the East Coast, we in Massachusetts, and there were several NASA centers, one in the Jet Propulsion Lab and NASA Ames Johnson Space Center. And so we had to figure out that it all work together. Well, first of all, you had to tell them, this isn't a grant, you're part of an institute. That means you have to contribute to the institute in one way or another. And we had, we had to get together. Well, I didn't want, you can't have everybody traveling all over the place because you'd be in the air constantly. So we developed electronic means of communicating. Now, initially to do that, I had a computer chap who was meant to know about computer equipment and communication stuff. This is still a little early in these days. But eventually I hired a anthropologist. And she actually had got her degree here at the University of Pennsylvania. And she had done her field work in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. But she was pretty good on she did work in business afterwards too. She was good on developing what we eventually called a culture of collaboration. And we developed a lot of interesting techniques for doing that. And in fact, we're now, Dr. Faithorn and I are now writing this up as an instruction to other institutions like it. We really learned a lot. Our video conferencing got very good. But the big thing is we knew each other. When we had a video conference, I, in effect, knew personally everybody on the other side. Now, part of the reason was that we had a lot of field work. I wouldn't be surprised 20% of our funding went into field work. And some of our scientists would be away for 6 months at Spitsbergen or up in the Arctic and doing, and I always encourage people to go on the field trips. And in fact, if anybody didn't have money for the field trip, you could apply to NAI Central. And so people got to know each other. If you're hanging together, you're in a tented camp for a week or 2 weeks, having all your meals together, and working together, people really get to know each other very well. So that was that helped. And then we had a lot of conferences. We had an annual get-together, a scientific meeting where a lot of the members came. And then there's something every year.
Yeah. So you can begin to see the connections between Barry's approach to his medical research and Barry's approach to building this culture of collaboration. That was really the key. Here's another quote from Barry. This is actually from an addendum he wrote to his Nobel biography, and he wrote this addendum in 2006. I understood that my mandate was to establish a basic science organization that could discover and understand natural phenomenon that related to early life and to life elsewhere. At an introductory address to the members of the Institute Executive Council, I told them that I did not expect them to do exactly what they said they would do in their grant applications. In a fast-moving field, observations made after the application had been written could greatly change the path of research. And this was greeted with cheers. So Barry's task was to create a virtual institute and to embody in this institute a culture of collaboration. And what he recognized was that this was going to take a combination of social infrastructure, technical infrastructure, and organizational infrastructure. The technical infrastructure was necessary in order to link people who were separated by distance. And so virtual collaboration technologies, an information technology working group, people from all of the distributed teams, readily accessible tech support, a one-stop shopping at what was called NAI Central, the small management organization at NASA Ames. And NAI Central, and the way it was structured and supported the teams, was part of the organizational infrastructure, and it was up to NAI Central to help build support for this culture, both in its own behavior and in the specific things that it did. And then social infrastructure, as Barry talked about, in-person meetings, field trip, good citizen rules, You weren't just working on your own grant, you were working as part of an institute. That was part of being a good citizen of the NAI. And importantly, observing people's behavior. So one of the metaphors Barry liked to use a lot is when you're building a college campus, don't decide beforehand where the walking paths are going to go. Build your buildings and then watch where people walk.
That's Cornell.
Then, this is the Ohio State University, but this has been done in many places now. Then build your paths where the people walk. So, he also recognized that there had to be a balance between centralization and autonomy. Autonomy, you want people to be able to do their thing, but you want them all working together, and that's got to be induced in part by some centralization. That's what NAI Central was all about. The anthropologist he hired, Lisa Faithorn, here is a picture of her taken at one of the annual meetings of the NAI in 2001. And in the article that he did publish with Lisa, and the reference to it is in my article, they say, we increasingly saw our work as an effort to influence NAI member attitudes and behaviors, orienting them toward the idea of being a virtual community. And this was hard. This was hard because they wrote proposals for 5-year awards, which were $1 million to $1.5 million a year, a significant amount of money then and now. And then 5 years later, they would be competing against each other again for continuing awards. And so they were competitors, then they were being asked to become collaborators, knowing that they were going to become competitors again. And this quote from the same article from an unnamed NASA PI illustrates the challenge that they were up against. So Barry also had other insights. One is he recognized that something like Facebook was actually kind of important, getting people to know each other visually as well as other details. So we started an astrobiology photo directory, and at that 2001 general meeting, actually with one of the early digital cameras, set up a photo booth so that people could all have their pictures taken. He loved getting people out into the field. This is a picture that was taken not during his directorship, but during mine. But it characterizes the kind of meetings that Barry had. And despite the fact that this is many years after he left the directorship, here we are at Yellowstone National Park, and who is front and center in this picture, and I can assure you that everybody in this picture thought it was completely natural for Barry to be right in the middle, prominently, as the continuing leader of this community. He also recognized that it was important that the NAI be open to people who weren't members of teams, and so he had a number of focus groups established which were open to anybody in the community. This is the virus focus group, which was his personal favorite, the one where he actually wanted to participate, and he co-chaired this with Ken Stedman from Portland State. He was also very committed to educating the next generation of astrobiologists. After he left the directorship of the NAI, he became the president of the American Philosophical Society, which is the oldest learned society in the United States, founded in 1743 by Benjamin Franklin. And with the NAI and with him as president of the APS, we established the Lewis and Clark Fund for Exploration and Field Research in Astrobiology, which provides, to this day, grants up to $5,000 to graduate students and postdocs and occasionally an undergraduate competitively to do field research in astrobiology. Barry also continued to go out into the field himself. Here is Barry up on Devon Island in the high Arctic at the NASA Hot and Mars project. And here he is about to go down into Iron Mountain Mine, where he had to overcome his claustrophobia. One final short thing from Barry.
So I decided, well, we can't do this by ourselves, and our institute, the NASA Astrobiology Institute, is going to encourage international cooperation, very much in line with what headquarters did also. So we set up kind of an affiliate, and the first one was with Spain, and they really were anxious to affiliate with us, with the NASA one, because that gave them validation in their own country. Well, the Spanish, this incredible scientist who ran that, he, even before I came on board, they had an affiliation. And based on that, he got a huge amount of money from Spain to build a great laboratory for astrobiology. And we went to England, and I spoke to the science advisor of the government, who was an old friend actually, science advisor of the British government, and he recommended scientist to scientist rather than government to government. So we did that. Then we have one in Australia, we don't have one in China, and with the European Union, and with France, and there are others that have involved. So we have this ring of, but one thing we made clear from the very origin is that it wasn't what the Soviets used to call hegemonic. That is, we didn't run it, and we said we didn't determine the quality of their science. In a way, we did, because they were looking for that anyhow. You know, the assumption was their government or some of their scientists decided who was going to represent them, and okay, we accepted that. But we did go through a very careful review of every international application. I had a really stellar group of reviewers, and the point was that we wanted to see compatibilities, and we would respond.
Okay, in the interest of time, I am already over my time, so I'm going to have to go through the last few slides very quickly. This is a picture taken at the signing of the agreement with the Astrobiology Society of Britain, which was the first of our UK partnerships. This is the Centro de Astrobiología in Madrid, which was established by Juan Pérez Mercader, and this is the institution that Juan got the money, leveraged the money from the Spanish government using the affiliation with the brand new NAI as an important part of establishing the credibility for pursuing this in Spain. Quite an accomplishment. As of 2012, the NAI had 10 international partners. That is currently 13. And this is just a picture of Barry with David Wynne-Williams of the British Antarctic Survey. We were able to realize in later years Barry's vision of the technical aspect of a virtual institute. That was something that was always difficult because the technology was not up to it during Barry's time. We realized it later. I don't have time to talk about that, but there's quite a bit that goes on there now. Another thing that was very important to Barry was involving underserved populations, and so the Institute started a Minority Institute sabbatical program and awarded sabbaticals at research labs to faculty from minority serving institutions. And this is a picture of some of us at the 2006 AppSciCon. And I would be remiss if I didn't call particular attention to something that Barry started shortly before his death, within about a year before his death. He called me up and said, I want to introduce you to Carolyn Brown, who is the director of the Kluge Center at the Library of Congress, where Barry was on the Librarian Scholar Council. And he said, I think that you and she are the right two people to create an astrobiology chair at the Kluge Center, at the council, at the library. And we did, with the help of Mary Wojtek at headquarters. It took 3 of us to manage our way through the bureaucracies. And of course, we have Stephen Dick. We have David Grinspoon. I should start at the top. We have David Grinspoon, the first Blumberg chair. We have Stephen Dick here, the second Blumberg chair. And the incoming Blumberg chair, who is going to start her tenure in the fall, is Susan Schneider, who has worked extensively in AI and in SETI, particularly with respect to superintelligent AI, and is well known to many people in this room. This is Barry and his wife Jean, with some of their kids and many grandchildren. And a final quote from Barry. People keep saying that basic research is just a fishing expedition. I never understood why people objected to that. After all, that's the way you catch fish. So I leave you with our quintessential fisherman, Baruch Samuel.
I think there'll be many opportunities throughout the course of this workshop for people to comment further and tell stories, but does anyone want to say a few things now? Ask questions, make additions?
I would particularly invite anybody, there are so many people in this room who knew Barry, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but I would particularly invite anybody who knew Barry to just share their reminiscences.
I'll add a word. First of all, that was amazing. Thank you. I have tears in my eyes right now. But sort of to add this comment about branching off once you have a grant, I often heard him say that if you were still doing 1 year into a grant what you proposed to do, you weren't doing creative research. I try to take to heart. But we went to, among other things, to Yellowstone with him many times and up to Rangeley. And Barry, as I recall, liked a martini before dinner. And I remember one time in Yellowstone telling the bartender after she had served Barry, and he turned around for dinner, I said, you know, you just served a Nobel Prize winner. And I think her hand was on the phone trying to call security to get me out of there, because clearly I was bombed out of my mind if I thought that guy had a Nobel Prize. He was just such a lovely man, and sort of along those lines, one time we were driving, he didn't want to drive in Yellowstone at that age, and he said, Lynn, would you drive? And I said, I'll make a deal with you, Barry. I will drive if you pump gas once and let me take a picture of you so I can say for the rest of my life I had a Nobel Prize winner pump gas for me. He said, deal. So I drove him for the next week.
David, yeah.
So maybe a dozen years ago, Edie and I went on a 1-week trip to England to celebrate, that APS put on to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the publication of Darwin's book, and Barry led the trip. And spending an entire week on a bus with Barry talking about evolution was an extraordinary experience. But Barry being Barry and interested in virtually everything, I was fascinated with probing him on virtually everything I could, but he was obsessed with the cases in my court and wanted to talk about those more than I could get him to talk about evolution. But that was Barry, right?
This was typical of
Yeah,
Barry.
right.
If you got into a conversation with him, he'd never talk about himself.
Right.
He would find out what you were interested
Yes.
in,
Yeah.
and then he would engage you in discussion
Yes,
about that.
during the week in London, I had an order from my court that I had to have Federal Express over 2 Supreme Court decisions that he wanted to read and talk about.
Well, our next, I know Martine is going to talk about Barry, and so you're the next up. Martine Rothblatt. Yeah, thank you,
Carl, that was wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
It's kind of like impossible to follow. That was just so beautiful, Carl, and I know that I think Barry would be beaming as brilliantly from your presentation as from this seminar itself. Just kept saying enough good things about that presentation. So I'd like to get out of here. There we go. So I'd like to talk a little bit about, this really is kind of a meditation on Barry, astrobiology, and medical research, since my job is to run a biotechnology company, and some people might wonder, what does that have to do with astrobiology? And I'd like to start with that blue circle up there. Barry loved the space program, and of course, this is the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11. I think he would be especially pleased that we were holding this seminar on such an important anniversary of an event that's so iconic to us all. And I'm going to touch briefly on the Nobel Prize, but I think Carl covered all of that so well. I'm going to kind of gloss over it. Going to talk about something which I find interesting, and I know Barry would have found very interesting, on how something seemingly so unrelated, like the funding of the Keck telescope, which is of great importance to astronomy, could in fact have a nexus with the Human Genome Project, which is something of great importance to biotechnology companies like my own. I'm going to talk briefly about how the head of scientific research at Genentech, a big biotechnology company, and now the head of Google's kind of human longevity company, California Life Extension Company, or Calico, had a nexus with Barry Blumberg and his hepatitis B research, and then flow ultimately into this workshop. I think the main themes of my talk are the hexagons here. Basic research leads to discoveries. I've never seen that more beautifully described than the quote that Carl had about fishing at the end. Astrobiology inspires biotechnology, which is something that I believe very much, and why I'm happy to sponsor this workshop. And finally, measurement and computation leads to healthcare innovation, and I think that's one of the parts of astrobiology I'm most excited about, is especially in the realm of exoplanetary research, the remarkable advances that have been made in measurement techniques and accuracy and precision. And of course, astronomy has led the way in terms of accuracy of measurement, I think, throughout scientific history. And advances in healthcare very much depend on those. Oops, wrong computer. So I'd like to start with saying Barry's quote here. He was a big believer in basic research. From such frontiers, we don't know what we'll discover, but we know we will discover something important. And that's kind of the question I get asked, why should a biotechnology company be interested in astrobiology? What specifically are you going to discover that's going to lead to a cure for cancer, for example? And the answer to those questions is that, we don't know exactly what we'll discover, but if we're discovering things like looking for molecules in atmospheres of planets around different stars, we're probably going to discover something important, even if it may be in the measurement and tools that we use to go to do that research. Another key thing about astrobiology that's relevant to life science research is that astrobiology has inspired many people to go into science. It's insane the number of stories that we hear about that now on the 50th anniversary of the lunar landing. I was watching it, my dad made me watch this, I wanted to watch it, an old black and white TV, I was watching it, and now all of this generation of people, populate science, not just in the physical sciences, but in the life sciences as well. So I think that's another really important reason there is nothing more inspirational of a field than astrobiology, because it unites life with the largest scales of reality. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, I think research in astrobiology is one of the coolest ways to advance our ability to have measurement techniques. I'm only going to show two little videos of Barry. And by luck, they're not the exact same ones that Carl showed. So here goes the first one.
Well, the study of what appear to be esoteric problems is a good way to approach science. And it's based on the notion that if you kind of understand nature and look at basic issues, you have the kind of confidence of faith that in time it's going to lead to something useful. Because you understand natural processes well enough, you'll see applications if you're kind of tuned that way. Now, medical research and medical science is by its very nature applied. You're always looking for something that will prevent disease or ameliorate it, cures, treatments, preventions. And as a consequence, but the whole basis of studying the whole reason for studying basic science is that will give you insights that lead to practical application. And my experience in medical research has been exactly that. When we started on this work on the inherited difference, I had no idea it would lead to the discovery of the hepatitis B virus, because that's an unusual way to approach the discovery of a virus. But what I was sure is that we'd find something important, but I didn't know what it was. So there are many connections between medical research issues and the sort of things that we do in astrobiology. For example.
So that's the first point there, that just studying in a field with such a wide bandwidth as astrobiology, you can't predict exactly what you're going to discover that's important for human therapeutic applications, but you're sure you're going to discover something that is. Some of the ideas I think Barry might have had in mind from my conversations with him: do molecules seen in the absorption spectrum of exoplanetary atmospheres imply biological processes? That would be something that I think Barry would be very excited about. If there are signs of exoplanetary biological processes, how do they differ among exoplanets and as compared with those on Earth? And finally, what insights for synthetic plant biology might be gained by looking at exoplanetary chemistry? So I'd like to next, move around the circle here and mention that an interesting point where astrobiology, in a sense, birthed what we would call the whole biotechnology industry of today. And it happened, perhaps in a somewhat accidental way. But Art Levinson, as he was in college, he read Art Levinson is the guy who's now head of Google's biotechnology arm and was head of Genentech. And he tells the story of how he read Carl Sagan and Shklovsky's book, Intelligent Life in the Universe, in the 1960s, which was a very early book on the topic of astrobiology. And he was tremendously inspired by it. And when he saw that there was a possibility for biology to be as universal as chemistry is, he got tremendously excited and became a life scientist based on that motivation, that excitement that you get out of astrobiology. Ironically, it was Art Levinson who ended up doing something that most people thought was impossible. In fact, all the other scientists at Genentech thought was impossible, which was to take Barry's vaccine that had been previously used out of human shed antigen samples, as Carl very beautifully described. But that's a kind of a scary, little dangerous way to get the vaccine to people. FDA doesn't really like those kind of methods. And generally, those type of vaccines would be produced in bacterial cells. But Levinson realized that it would be, actually 10 times more productive to do it in mammalian cells. there had at that time never been a vaccine that was produced in mammalian cells, in Chinese hamster ovary cells. The hepatitis B vaccine, which if you get one now, that's how your vaccine comes from. And Lonson was the first one to do that. So part of the main reason, and it turned out that even though all the Genentech people said that a non-bacterial method of producing a vaccine wouldn't work, would be prohibitively expensive, all those experts turned out to be wrong. Art, who was somewhat of an iconoclast, still is somewhat of an iconoclast, turned out to be correct. And the reason that this vaccine is really so affordable, so universally available, is in large part due to, first of all, Barry's discovery of it, and secondly, somebody who was inspired by astrobiology to go into biotechnology, creating a much more efficient and effective way of producing that vaccine. So you don't, I'm sure Carl had no idea writing this book that it would end up with, like, you know, a mass vaccine. Barry had this idea, but here's what happened. Actually, I was thinking Carl Sagan, you know, writing that book, had no idea that Art would read it and then, you know, build on top of that for Barry's vaccine. So, in any event, I think that's a little thread that ties together astrobiology, biotechnology. The mind, I believe, is one of the most important therapeutics we have. People are amused that placebo is the most effective pill anybody has ever developed, but it's really true. And of course, you know, our brains control, you know, ultimately all of our bodies. The vagus nerve is all coiled up within the brain at its base, and through the nervous system, every single cell in the body is touched. So it's not really, you know, it's not unphysical that the placebo effect can be a very potent therapeutic, but it's one that is easily misused and manipulated, and certainly not one that the government wants to spend taxpayer dollars on. Nevertheless, astrobiology, including exoplanetary studies and ideas about other Earths, is tremendously exciting and empowering to people, and especially students. It's perhaps like the main reason why I so love and am inspired by Green Bank and everything that you do here, because you don't really shy away from what is to many students the most exciting part of astronomy and physics, the prospect that there might be life forms throughout the cosmos. And by stimulating millions of additional students worldwide to focus on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, there will be many more discoveries. There will be more Art Levinsons. There'll be thousands of more Art Levinsons because of the very work that we're doing in the field of astrobiology. So I think that this workshop and many more workshops like this, through its inspirational role in education, will in and of itself result in many more therapeutic breakthroughs. Another interesting connection that's not well appreciated is how the Human Genome Project had a genesis in the Keck telescope. So Robert Sinsheimer, UC Santa Cruz chancellor, wanted the school to be as renowned for biology as it is for astronomy. And he found a foundation, the Hoffman Foundation, that had agreed to half the cost for building the, at that time, largest optical telescope, the segmented telescope that ultimately became known as the Keck telescope, and gave the University of California the largest grant that it had ever received, $36 million. But Sinsheimer had kind of, you know, lowballed somewhat the cost of this telescope and was not able to gather the rest of the funding for it, which finally came from the Keck Foundation on the condition that the telescope be known as the Keck telescope. Well, UC had already promised the name of the telescope as the Hoffman telescope, but none of us call it the Hoffman telescope, we call it the Keck telescope. So the largest grant that they ever got, they had to give back. And that was painful for University of California. It was especially painful, I'm sure, for Chancellor Sinsheimer. But he immediately thought there must be some way I could get back this $36 million that I just had. So he thought maybe he could get the Hoffmans as interested in big biology as they were in big astronomy. He organized the first workshops on the topic of sequencing the entire human genome in the mid-1980s, including many people who are still alive and hardworking today, like George Church. And they came in with a very radical proposal for the 1980s that we could sequence the entire human genome, and this would give us a roadmap for curing countless diseases and produce, a renaissance of knowledge about therapeutics. He went to the Hoffman group and said, we'll call this like the Hoffman Human Genome Sequencing Project. Well, unfortunately, Mr. Hoffman had died even before the time of the first grant. Mrs. Hoffman unfortunately died actually the day after they gave the $36 million to University of California. And what you were left with were the trustees of the Hoffman Foundation. And some trustees are awesome, some trustees are not. And these were not the awesome trustees. I don't want to say anything more about that, but I'll simply say they didn't give any more money. However, what had happened is this workshop with all of these bigwigs, all of the founders of recombinant DNA research and the modern tools of biotechnologies, the people who were at the famous Asilomar meeting on gene editing, all of these people thought this human genome sequencing idea was actually something that was tractable, that was doable. And it went from this meeting to the first group that actually picked up the baton and started funding a human genome sequencing effort was the Department of Energy, interested in the effect of radiation on base pairs. Well, guess what? That could be something of great interest when you're sending people to Mars and people through the radiation belt and people at higher risk of cosmic ray damage. Our interest in what is the effect of breakage of base pairs and what kind of therapeutics can we develop to help repair base pair breakage. We all have constant base pair breakage by the thousands every single day. Our bodies repair them. The rates in space will probably be higher. What new therapeutics can we get to repair those? That's the kind of inspiration in therapeutics that you get from studying astrobiology. And hey, if you figure out a better way to prepare base pair breakage for astronauts in space, that's going to help all the millions and billions of people on Earth who finally their own bodies can't keep up with the accumulated base pair breakage as we move into later and later decades of our life. So I think this is yet another example how astrobiology is tremendously inspiring and can lead to huge breakthroughs in biotechnology and in medical therapeutics. Lastly, I'd like to talk about computational techniques. From my understanding, these computational techniques are absolutely essential for astrobiology missions, such as TESS, and I'm crossing everything I have, W first, and even Starshade, so hoping all that stuff happens. But just as a layperson, I am completely blown away by the computational techniques that underlaid Kepler and even earlier efforts, and the efforts to detect frequency Doppler shifts from vast distances and minuscule really amounts of Doppler shifting compared to the type of Doppler shifts that we see when we look at other things in space. But these type of computational techniques are absolutely essential for the future of drug development as well. At United Therapeutics, our company, we have a computational laboratory for in silico molecular biology, where our goal is in fact to digitally replicate an entire portion of a body and ultimately an entire body. It could be an animal, a rat body, a mouse body, it could be a segment of the human body, and then do that digital replication at an accurate enough level, down at the level of molecular biology, down at the level of cellular biology, down at the level of DNA expression, so that we could insert molecules digitally into this computational system and test literally thousands of different analogs of molecules a day to see which one addresses the dysfunction that's at the heart of a particular disease. And I feel, quite confident that within the next decade or two, that we will be able to, in fact, develop medicines completely in silico. All of the toxicology testing that's now done in, dozens of rats and dogs and has not very clear one-to-one mapping and application in humans, because things that are safe in animals aren't always safe in humans. We will be able to come up with a much better means of toxicology testing, and then even more important, come up with a much better way of determining the efficacy of drugs instead of testing them in a couple of thousand people who it may or may not work, and those couple of thousand people are not all going to have the same polymorphisms that Carl described so well as the millions and tens and hundreds of millions of people in the population at large. But as more and more genomes are sequenced, which are being done in the millions right now, thanks to the Human Genome Project, thanks to the Keck telescope. So as more of those genomes are sequenced, we can test these drugs in literally millions of genomically sequenced systems, all within a computer system, operating at the type of speeds which you guys take for granted in the field of high energy physics. So thousands of digitized human genomes, we could accomplish large phase 3 clinical trials in a single day. And that sounds crazy, but believe me, I don't have to believe me, I'm sure you yourselves would know, just a few decades ago, it would sound crazy to say that we are increasing the numbers of confirmed exoplanets that we found by the hundreds every single year. I mean, that's astonishing, but in fact, that's what's happened with Kepler, and that's what's going to happen with TESS. So on this 50th anniversary of Apollo 11, I'd like to conclude by asking what observation might Dr. Blumberg have offered. As you know, Apollo 11 was an epitome of kind of human in space. Okay, it wasn't a robot, it was a human. We heard a brilliant story, my partner Bina and I last night at the Air and Space Museum from Buzz Aldrin, how a circuit breaker had popped on the Ascent module, and nobody at Houston could figure out how to fix it. They didn't have the right tools to fix it. I don't think a robot could have figured out how to fix it. You could get electrically shocked if you pushed your finger in there to fix it. There was power behind it. And Buzz first thought about using a ballpoint pen, and then thought it might conduct the electricity through to him, and then used his felt tip pen and fixed the circuit breaker. The Ascent module suddenly powered up. Houston got a radio signal, said, "What do you do? It's powered up." And off the Ascent module went, and everybody lived happily ever after. So people, I think, are very important in the space. And here's something that Barry might have talked about on this 50th anniversary.
It's going to take. Then there's this question: can you? What is it about a human that makes them different than a machine? And for example, in NASA, there's always has been a debate more outside of NASA than in it on whether we should have human exploration. And I have that first image, if I can see it, please. This is a picture of Harrison Schmitt on the moon. He and his co-astronaut were the last two people on the moon, right? That was a long time ago. And Harrison was the only, Jack Schmitt was the only trained scientist who went to the moon. He was trained as a geologist. And he wrote a field trip report after he got back. And if I can see the next one, please. And he makes the point there that he was able to make observations, because he was a human, that a robotic device could not have done. Now, one of the great abilities that humans have is to be able to kind of deal with stuff they've never had any experience with in the past. In other words, they can see and perceive that something is new. Now, can you expect a robot that's been programmed by someone, by another human, and programmed on the basis of known knowledge? Can you train it to perceive, understand, question, be curious about something that it's never seen or conceived of before, nor has it programmed? It's going to.
So I think what Barry is saying there is that biology is imminent, not only in astrobiology, but actually in astronomy itself. The unique synthetic properties of the human mind are needed to make the most important discoveries in astronomy. Curiosity, questioning authority, favoring practicality, even acting lovingly in the sense of caring about other life of any type, lead us to see in data, or want to see, more than can be hardwired in code. I think Barry's message to me on this astrobiology workshop is that the value of research in astrobiology is the value of horizontal meme transfer, the rare opportunity to exchange plasmid gems of knowledge from the most unexpected of sources. Thank you so much, all of you, for traveling the distance to come here.
While we're getting set up, I just wanted to say something that I had forgotten to mention. You will see name tags with people that have a blue ribbon on them. That means it's a local staff person who is sworn to do your bidding. So if you have questions or anything else, please try one of us. The next talk is by Ken Kellerman on Green Bank, the birthplace of SETI. I think that's the right one. Yes, birthplace of modern SETI.
Yeah, I feel a bit intimidated about giving this talk. I feel a little bit like the guy who got swept away in the great Johnstown flood, with all the water and everything, and he died and he went to heaven and he told everybody about how terrible it was, with all this water as far as you could see. And he talked to all the people and he was asked to give a talk. And he got up before an audience. And just as he was walking up to the podium, St. Peter leaned over to him and said, "Be careful what you say. Noah is in the audience." Frank should really be giving this talk. Correct me if I misstep anywhere. Frank did really have dark hair. He wasn't born with white hair. But actually, it all started a few years earlier. What I'd like to do is talk about Project Ozma and a little bit about what happened in the next 60 years, both in Green Bank and elsewhere in the country and the world. As I said, it started in the late 1950s. AUI had started NRAO, looking to build a big radio telescope. First ideas were something in the order of 600 feet, biggest telescope in the world. They realized that was a little bit too ambitious, maybe something like 300 feet. And finally, they decided on a 140-foot telescope, but it would be equatorially mounted, which would make it the largest equatorially mounted telescope in the world. That was a big mistake. It was hard to design. It was contracted out. They started to build a telescope before the design was finished. Contractor ran into a lot of trouble. There were strikes. But finally, they managed to fabricate the main components and have it shipped to Green Bank with great difficulty, had to rebuild bridges and tunnels to get it here. And big pieces were built out of something called A 373 steel. Now, A373 steel was used during the Second World War on ships in the North Atlantic. Found out later it was subject to what's called brittle fracture. And in the cold weather, some of the merchant ships sailing across the North Atlantic would just crack in half and sink. And somebody realized that sometimes it gets pretty cold in Greenbank in the wintertime, and there was concern about maybe this wasn't the right kind of material to use for the 140-foot telescope. So everything was scrapped. The pieces were either cut up and sent to Brookhaven to be used as shielding for reactors, and I believe the rest of it is still buried here in Greenbank down by the present 140-foot. The NRAO was in trouble, didn't have a telescope, contracted to buy a telescope from the Blauox Corporation. It was designed by Howard Taylor, working at the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism. It was thought to be essentially off the shelf. Dedication was scheduled to coincide with the meeting of the AUI board here in Greenbank. But as it turned out, this telescope also wasn't finished by the time of the dedication. The basic structure was finished, but there was no surface. Unfortunately, Howard Taylor had died prior to the completion of the telescope, but the dedication was attended by his wife, by Merrill Tube, who is the head of the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism and played a major role in the formation of NRAO. His wife, Howard Taylor's daughter, Judy, and his son, David. And of course, we're pleased that David is here with us today. He's become an expert in the legal aspects of extraterrestrial communication with extraterrestrial civilizations, and also has a daytime job as a federal judge. Frank Drake had just joined NRAO and realized that the 85-foot telescope had sufficient sensitivity that if there were other civilizations with approximately our technical capabilities, that it would be possible to receive their transmissions. Equipment was being built for other experiments, hydrogen line experiments, the target detection of the Zeeman experiment at 21 centimeters, and so Frank essentially piggybacked on so we didn't have to build the separate equipment, didn't have to spend any extra money to use the Taylor telescope and the 21 centimeter equipment for an attempt to see if he could detect anything from extraterrestrial civilizations. And while the equipment was being built, they received a preprint from Giuseppe Cocconi and Phil Morrison, suggesting the possibility of searching for extraterrestrial civilizations at 21 centimeters. And Cocconi and Morrison had picked 21 centimeters because hydrogen was is the most abundant element in the universe. It was relatively simple to build equipment and transmitters and receivers, and they argued that it was the natural frequency to search for other civilizations. And they concluded their paper with this comment: the probability of success is difficult to estimate, but if you never search, the chances of success are zero. This received a lot of publicity. It was in all the newspapers, and I think subsequently it's the Cocconi and Morrison paper that is credited or believed to have started the modern era of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. But in fact, Project Ozma had actually, the planning for it had started earlier than that. It was really Frank that started the modern era. By that time, Otto Struve had become the director of NRAO. And I guess they were a little bit put off that Cocconi and Morrison were receiving all this credit. On the other hand, searching for extraterrestrial intelligence at that time was a little bit delicate. It was on the border of science fiction. NRAO had all these problems with a 140-foot telescope. Had the largest budget of any radio observatory in the country. Probably the NRAO budget was greater than the sum of all the other U.S. radio astronomy facilities. And I was a graduate student at Caltech at the time, and we certainly looked at NRAO and laughed at all the money they were spending with no scientific results. And so they had to tread lightly. It was a fine line between advertising the SETI project, Project Ozma, and keeping it quiet. And they had been keeping it quiet, not secret, but not advertising it. But in November of 1959, Otto Struve gave a series of lectures at MIT. I had just graduated in June of that year, so I missed the lectures. I attended the Compton lectures of the previous year, which is given by Niels Bohr. So it was a big deal, and it was highly publicized. I don't have a video of what happened, but here's an audio recording by Otto Struve describing Project Ozma. What do I have? Oh.
And let me make sure that your audio is up all the way.
I think it is.
The astronomer is aware of the fact that while the probability at present is exceedingly small that such signals will be found, we must not absolutely assume that all signals from the sky are produced by natural causes. Many scientists are quite actively concerned with this very problem. There are scientists at Harvard and probably at MIT who are thinking about it. There are scientists elsewhere, and many of us have seen a report that has thus far come only in a mimeograph form from two American scientists who are now in Europe. And I believe that their paper is to be published in Nature. At Green Bank, we are also thinking about this problem, and there is underway a project which goes under the name OZMA, and I do not recall what these letters stand for, but those of us who forget what the name means call it the project of the little green men.
2 years late, these lectures were published. For some reason, it took 2 years to get it out into print. And curiously, in the published version of the lectures, Struve describes, he has a section on radio astronomy, he has a section on man's place in the universe, and in that latter part, he describes, mentions the possibility of communicating with that there might be other civilizations in the universe and the possibility of communicating with them, but he doesn't mention Project Ozma at all. I don't know whether he was. Of course, this was 2 years later, and the project had already been done unsuccessfully. In April of 1960, so Frank observed two stars, Tau Ceti and Epsilon Rodney. Spent about 150 hours on the Fatal Telescope. They had only one channel, 100 hertz resolution, and had to tune that across the expected frequency, and didn't detect anything. This is a copy of the telescope logbook. The marks in red correspond to the Ozma observations. A couple of years later, Frank organized, with support from the National Academy of Science, what I believe is the first conference on extraterrestrial intelligent life. It's held here in Green Bank. Otto Struve was the chair. Cohen and Morrison attended. Su Wang, who was an expert in planet formation. John Lilly, who was an expert on talking to dolphins, and we'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. Melvin Kalman, who was a chemist, and coincidentally got word that he had received the Nobel Prize that year in chemistry during the meeting here in Green Bank, and Carl Sagan and Barney Oliver, who would later play a big role in SETI. The conference, I think, tried to address some very basic questions, which I think have been the basis of all subsequent SETI conferences. What are the conditions that intelligent transmissions might be observable? And is it worthwhile to observe with current equipment? Or is the prospects for success so little that it's not worth the trouble? And what observations are needed so that even a negative result becomes scientifically interesting? We're all familiar with the Drake equation, which was presented at that Green Bank conference. We'll be having drinks in the lounge where that happened. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but as you know, the number of expected civilizations depends on the rate of star formation, the number of stars in the galaxy, the number of stars that have planets, the number of planets that are reasonably like the Earth, the number of those that might develop life, and so on. All these were essentially unknown at the time, but an optimistic guess at their value led to some possibility that the searches might be successful with existing equipment. And over the next decades, there's been a lot of debate, of course, about what's the right frequency to use, what are the right techniques. 21 centimeter hydrogen line was obvious. Any extraterrestrial would recognize this as a basic frequency, the intergalactic calling frequency. It's also part of the spectrum where there's low galactic noise. But when Project Ozma was run, this was just a few years before the OH line had been discovered at 18 centimeters, which is vastly stronger, much stronger. And maybe that's the right frequency to use. Also, any really intelligent civilization wouldn't be transmitting at 21 centimeters in the hydrogen line. It would be reserved for radio astronomy, just like it is on the Earth. Well, 18 centimeters turns out not to be so good either because of all the OH emission. And I think it was Barney Oliver that first suggested, you observe between the OH line and the hydrogen line, and hydrogen and OH together, H2O make water, and we refer to this as the water hole. It's a few hundred megahertz at a convenient frequency. And at the time, it was relatively free from man-made radio frequency interference. That's no longer true today. There were other suggestions, particularly from the Soviet Union, that you don't necessarily have to find a signal in the spectrum, but you look for a radio source that's so small that it can't possibly be coming from a natural cause, and so you use VLBI to do this, and that ultimately developed into having to use very long baseline interferometry on such a long baseline that you couldn't do it from the Earth, and that was the basis of the Russian radio Astron mission, which took 30 years to develop. It finally was flown about a decade ago, in which Green Bank has played a major role. There are other suggestions by Charlie Towns, for example, that maybe we shouldn't be looking for radio signals at all. With lasers, you could generate huge beams that might be more easily be detectable. Paul Horowitz started a program in optical SETI. It was Freeman Dyson's idea that you could just look for the leftover heat radiation from a civilization that would be expending so much energy that as I say, you could detect the heat radiation. Ron Bracewell said, well, you shouldn't be looking for electromagnetic signals at all, but other civilizations might send probes to go around our solar system, and they would just sit there waiting for thousands and tens of thousands of years till they detected some sign of intelligence on the Earth, and then would start communicating. And other suggestions had to do with gamma rays, which actually Cohen and Morrison had considered right from the beginning. I think we know about all the challenges to SETI. The most obvious thing, of course, is the technical one. You're looking for signal, you don't really know where to look. I think Jill Tarter has described it to like going to the beach, picking up a cup full of water and trying to tell about all the population of animals that might be existing throughout the oceans. Historically, it's been very difficult to get funding for SETI research. It's always been on the border of science fiction. It had something to do with UFOs. At least until recently, I think the opportunities for career advancement, people that searching for extraterrestrial signals was not good. I think that may be changing. But perhaps most important, SETI is not falsifiable. That is, there's no experiment that you can do to show that there is no extraterrestrial intelligence. You can keep pushing the limit, but you can't prove that they're not there. In the early, I guess it was the summer of 1971, John Billingham and Barney Oliver, Vice President of Hewlett-Packard, ran a summer study. I think it was an academic study. It wasn't really planned to do anything about what it might take to detect the extraterrestrial civilization, and they came up with this so-called Cyclops array, which would be 1,000 100-meter antennas and would cost realistically some tens of billions of dollars. It wasn't really a proposal or anything, but this got out into the popular society, and people associated SETI with spending tens of billions of dollars, and kind of scared people off. But then things got serious, I think, in the middle of the 1970s. There was a series of NASA SETI workshops that Phil Morrison chaired, and they published this report. I think Frank and I are probably the only people left who participated in that activity. But we concluded that SETI was, search for extraterrestrial intelligence was serious, and it was timely and appropriate to begin a serious study. And it could be done with, significant study could be done with existing equipment, and there might be, spin-off benefits. And then ultimately, if necessary, one could build larger and larger facilities as they were needed. We also commented that search for extraterrestrial intelligence should be basically an international activity, but one that the U.S. could and should take a lead. Following that, there was another series of SETI science working group meetings, which concluded, in spite of all the possibilities I mentioned earlier, that the best place to begin a search is actually in the radio spectrum, but commented that it's urgent because other radio activities are building up, and radio frequency interference is soon going to take over, and they need to get this done before that happens. For reasons which aren't completely clear to me, NASA became a focal point of SETI research. I think it probably had to do with the fact that the people that were interested worked for NASA, particularly NASA Ames and JPL. But it's basically a ground-based activity. It's not one that you would normally associate NASA with. And I think with time that came back to haunt them. But the working group proposed a detailed program of both targeted research that is looking at specific stars and also sky surveys. And also, in addition to being a NASA mission, also recommended some modest funding for university-based principal investigators to do their own activity. And I think that around this time, SETI started to become, or look, respectable. In 1975, the House Appropriations Committee commissioned Marcia Smith to write a report on the possibility of intelligent life elsewhere in the universe, which she did, and that was a very widely circulated report. I mentioned the NASA workshops. In 1982, the IAU formed a new commission on bioastronomy and SETI, and starting in 1982 and then 91 and again in 2001, the National Academy Decade Reviews in Astronomy specifically mention the search for extraterrestrial intelligence as being an appropriate part of astronomy, and supported and suggested its support. So based on that, that's kind of support, NASA developed this, what was called the Microwave Observing Project. It was a 10-year mission costing somewhat over $100 million. Consisted both of a targeted search using the Green Bank 140-foot telescope in Green Bank, Parkes telescope, Arecibo, and some other antennas, and also a sky survey using the Goldstone tracking antenna and other parts of the Deep Space Network. But then the shit hit the fan. First, in 1978, Senator Proxmire awarded SETI the Microwave Observing Project his Golden Fleece Award, and suggested that, well, maybe SETI could be postponed for a few million light years. I think over the next 5 years, SETI research was in and out of NASA budgets. It would be included in the House version of the budget, but not in the Senate, the other way around. Some years it actually got funded at a modest level, less than the $10 million a year, but enough to get started and do some observations. But then the killer came in 1993 when SETI had been included. The Microwave Observing Project, which was now called the High Resolution Microwave Survey, which some Congress said, well, you just changed the name to make it look different so we wouldn't recognize it. It was included in both the House and the Senate bills, and actually reached the floor of the Senate, and Senator Bryan from Nevada introduced the amendment essentially killing the HRMS funding. And he issued a press release which read, "The great Martian chase may finally have come to an end. As of today, millions have been spent, and yet we have to bag a single little green fellow. Not a single Martian has said, 'Take me to your leader,' and not a single flying saucer has applied for FAA approval." So this was only a year or two after the Hubble telescope debacle. NASA wasn't going to rock the boat for this $10 million SETI initiative and fight it. And even though this only officially affected this was actually in 1992, but it was a 1993 budget. Even though it only legally affected the 1993 budget, I think NASA got cold feet and essentially not only would not continue the HRMS project, but wouldn't consider any other SETI projects. And similarly, although it didn't legally impact the NSF at all, NSF wasn't, had its own agenda and wasn't going to, also had a policy for a while of not accepting any grant proposals for SETI work. Meanwhile, there were still individual proposals and projects to use some of the Green Bank telescopes for SETI work, and that was done, but people were expected to do this as an ordinary, had to go through the grant and peer review process and be published in the ordinary scientific literature and not in the New York Times. So SETI itself went private. Frank and Jill Tarter and others formed the SETI Institute, continued with private funding the HRMS project, renamed now Project Phoenix, and of course no results. There were other activities, Serendip, which Dan Wertheimer started, SETI at Home, and more recently, of course, Breakthrough Listen, and I think we'll hear more about all these things later in the conference. There was also significant research in the Soviet Union. In the US, almost all SETI activities were concentrated on looking for narrow-band CW signals, modulated, of course. Whereas in the Soviet Union, they concentrated on looking for broadband pulsed emission, I do wonder if, about 10 years ago, radio astronomers discovered so-called fast radio bursts. If the Soviets had sufficient sensitivity back in the 1960s to discover a fast radio burst, whether or not they would have interpreted that as a possible intelligent signal. So there have been lots of conferences and workshops over the years. I've just listed a few here. Of course, the first one here in Green Bank in 1961. The Soviets had their own conference in 1964 in Armenia, problems of communication with extraterrestrial civilizations. And then in 1971, there was a conference in Burikhan in Armenia that was attended not only by radio astronomers, but by a wide range of people interested in the sociology of SETI and communicating with extraterrestrials. I think at this conference, up until this time, the acronym SETI had actually been spelled with a C, where C stood for communication with extraterrestrial intelligence, or civilizations intelligence. It's my memory, Frank, correct me, that it doesn't appear in the official proceedings, but it was a after-dinner discussion in the Burikhan Observatory after a few bottles of Armenian cognac. It was Frank and Carl Sagan, Kardashev, Sklovsky. I was standing by the side listening, that somebody said, well, you can't communicate with them until you find them. And so it got changed to SETI with an S. Is that your memory, Frank? Because I don't think that's documented anywhere in writing. After that, there were similar conferences in Tallinn, in Estonia, in Santa Cruz, mostly U.S. participants, but also a number from the Soviet Union. Very few from any other country, I think, other than Estonia. In 1986, we had a 25th anniversary here in Green Bank. It's organized by George Saustad and myself. And then 10 years ago, SETI at 50, that Jay organized, and of course this meeting. I mentioned the 1976 NASA SETI workshops, and in 2020 there was another set of NASA workshops. This is a picture of at the 25th anniversary of those people who had been involved in the original Project Ozma that were still here in Green Bank at the time. The 25th anniversary, Frank gave a review of Project Ozma, described it. There was also a discussion of the NASA programs and programs from other observatories, and of course a review of the strategy, one of the things I mentioned earlier. The meeting 10 years ago, when Ozma was 50 years old, also discussed the strategy, but I think it was more of this was attended by about 50 people, more than the earlier meetings, and I think emphasized more of the societal impact, the consequences of a successful communication, and also the implications of failure. I think probably can come back to some of that this week. In 1997 and 98, Ron Eakers chaired another NASA SETI study called NASA 2020, which again reviewed the optimum strategies, laid out a roadmap for SETI research in the 2 decades, which are about to come to an end. We also came up with this concept, somewhat analogous to the Cyclops, but that the most cost-effective way to get high sensitivity was to build an array of a large number of small antennas, which became known as the large N, small d concept. And that was actually the concept behind the so-called 1HT telescope, which was funded by Paul Allen and became, now we know, as the Allen Telescope Array. Unfortunately, they were a little bit too optimistic about how much it was going to cost, and ended up only being able to implement 42 antennas out of the planned 350. It was also the basis for a lot of the concept of the square kilometer array, which is still being pursued. And again, the cost estimates, which were originally of the order of a few $100 million, have now escalated to some billions or more. And the large N has become smaller, and the small d has become larger. So to summarize, I checked with Jill Charter, who unfortunately wasn't able to be here this week, but she's always kept up a catalog of SETI studies, and she told me that there have been more than 1,800 publications since Frank's first project. Current SETI projects, depending on how you do the calculations, the order of 10 million times more sensitive than Project Ozma, but the results, of course, are the same. And of course, even way back, this led Enrico Fermi to make this famous statement, where is everybody? And this is becoming a serious issue. As I said, at one point, at the 1961 conference, I don't think any of these numbers were really known, but now we know a lot of them. We know the rate of star formation. We know that almost every star in the galaxy has planets. A lot of these planets are Earth-like, have rocks. We don't know the possibility that life might develop, or intelligent life, but we can make some reasonable guesses. And the big unknown is the lifetime of intelligent civilization. If it's short, then this number is small. And if this number is small, that may mean that this number is short. That's a bit scary. But of course, Martin Rees has made the famous statement that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But still, what are we doing wrong? And more important, what should we be doing differently? I think it's important to keep in mind how little we know about what it is we're doing. I can't think of any other area of human inquiry where we know so little about where to look, how to look, what we're looking for, or even if there's anything to look for. Thank you.
It's time for a couple quick questions. I want to remind everybody that we will be eating together, we will be drinking together, we will be staying together for 3 days. So we'll all get to know each other very well and have time for a lot of discussions. But right now, yes.
All right. Thanks. That was a great talk. I really enjoyed that history. At the end, you said there were 1,800 SETI investigations. I think what Jill was referring to is the number of abstracts in ADS that are at least tangentially related to SETI. So we shouldn't interpret that as that's how much searching's been done. It's just the number of papers that mention SETI in ADS in any way. The actual number of searches Jill keeps track of on a website called TechnoSearch.
I think that was 700 or something. Yeah, well, do you know what that number is?
I don't know what the number is, but of course they vary tremendously in sensitivity and methodology and all sorts of things. And so I just wanted to clarify, what are we doing wrong? And I'd say what we're doing wrong is we just, you said it was a glass of water in the ocean. We should work up to some larger volumes before we declare that we're doing something wrong.
So Charlie first.
Yeah, Ken, earlier in your talk, you talked about the problem with non-falsifiability, which is a problem for SETI. But then you mentioned in the 2009 Ozma F50 that they talked about the implications of failure. Those two statements seem to be mutually exclusive to me. You can't have a failure if it's not falsifiable.
Yes, at what point, at what sensitivity level do you begin to worry that there is nothing there? I mean, it's just, Fermi's question.
So it is falsifiable, and that's a...
No, you can never prove that there's nothing there.
Well, we're scientists, we don't prove things, right?
You get more and more worried that there might be. But I think Frank may talk about this on Sunday. Maybe we shouldn't be looking at our galaxy. Maybe we should be looking at Kardashev Type 3 civilizations in other galaxies. Or
Actually, the title of that session at that workshop was, "What have we learned from 50 years of science?" And there are many possibilities. Yes, Steve, one last question.
Yeah, to your question about why NASA took up SETI, I remember John Billingham telling me that here he was sitting at NASA Ames. Across the way is the Life Sciences building with all the people doing exobiology, which is just looking for microbes and the Viking and all of that. So the question is, who's going to look, beyond microbes at intelligence? It's not going to be the biologists. That's a totally different community. So Billingham took it up under the guise of the space sciences, and it's always been a problem within NASA where this would fit exactly in NASA. It's not really a good fit, but it certainly wasn't going to happen with the biologists, and what NASA did was put it under space science, and at headquarters it went under all kinds of different things, astrophysics and before.
So like I said, it was because of the interest of some specific people.
If Billingham hadn't had the interest.
But it's continued, of course, and it is a ground-based science, and historically, when any of us have gone to NASA to ask for money and support to do any ground-based astronomy, the best we can get is, Ed Wiley used to say, a metro ticket to go to Boston to talk to the NSF. So why isn't SETI being supported more at the NSF?
The exobiology people were doing lots of origins of life research, which is laboratory work. Of course, that was in the service of going to Mars.
Okay, wait, question all the way in the back, yeah.
This is not actually a question, it's a clarification. SETI was funded out of exobiology by John Lockman in the middle 80s. So it was funded out of the space science part of NASA because the life science part associated with human spaceflight did not fund radio observations. But the space sciences also had exobiology, and that's where SETI was funded. So it was funded by biologists, just out of the space exploration part of NASA, not the human spaceflight life sciences part.
Last comment for now. Okay.
This discussion makes me curious, and maybe some of the historians in the audience know the answer to this, but how was SETI funded within the Soviet Union? Was it considered part of radio astronomy, or is there any counterpart to this diagram, organizational diagram that we know of in the Soviet Union, how it was treated?
Rebecca, you?
Yeah, sure. So in the Soviet Union, my understanding is that it was largely individual scientific projects supported by individuals within their institution. So scientists at the Sternberg Astronomical Institute, but it wasn't pursued at all, to my knowledge, maybe Ken knows better, by Roscosmos or any NASA equivalent in the Soviet Union. So it was more individual pioneers rather than large institutions.
I believe they all work on the the Soviet Academy of Science. They're all Academy of Science institutes.
If you're a party member sufficiently to help and you like the stuff, then you can make it happen.
Yeah, that is actually true. I mean, Yosef Shklovsky was a huge supporter of SETI early on, and he had the Lenin Prize, and so it would be hard to tell him no.
We will continue this a lot over the next couple of days, but for now, this is the time for the conference photo. So could everyone just go outside the door there on the grass, and then immediately afterwards grab a cup of coffee and come on back in.